Have you ever wondered if a single act of kindness could change your entire life? In 1881, a lonely rancher in New Mexico made a choice that most men wouldn't dare to make. And when the sun set that evening, nothing would ever be the same. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast ocean of sand and sagebrush where the only law was survival. Jonathan Wade knew this land better than most. 15 years working a small cattle ranch on the edge of Apache territory had taught him to respect both the beauty and the brutality of the frontier. He was a quiet man, weathered by sun and solitude, standing just over 6 feet tall with hands calloused from years of rope work and fence mending. His face bore the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades staring into the relentless southwestern sun, and his sandy hair had begun to show streaks of gray at the temples, though he was barely 40 years old. He had lost his wife Catherine to fever 3 winters past, and the grief had settled into his bones like desert cold. After burying her on the hill overlooking the ranch, Jonathan had chosen to remain alone rather than return to civilization. His neighbors thought him strange, perhaps even touched in the head for staying in such isolation. But Jonathan found a strange comfort in the emptiness. The land demanded nothing from him except honest work, and it never asked questions he couldn't answer. On a scorching August morning, while checking fence lines near Copper Canyon about 8 miles northeast of his property, Jonathan heard something that didn't belong in that wilderness, the soft, desperate crying of a child. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place in that vast emptiness, that at first Jonathan thought the heat was playing tricks on his mind. He'd been riding since dawn, and the temperature had already climbed past 100 degrees. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Dusty, had stopped mid-step, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Animals knew things humans often missed. Behind a cluster of red rocks, no more than 50 yards from a dried creek bed lined with skeletal cottonwood trees, sat a small Apache boy. The child couldn't have been older than 7, his dark eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, his lips cracked and bleeding from thirst. His left ankle was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, clearly twisted or broken, and dried blood marked a nasty gash on his forehead where he'd probably fallen. The boy wore only a breechcloth and small moccasins, his copper skin burned darker by exposure. He had been out here for some time. Jonathan froze in his saddle, his mind racing through possibilities and dangers. Every instinct screamed caution. Apache warriors could be nearby searching for the boy, and any white man found with one of their children would be killed without question or mercy. The wars between settlers and Apaches had created a canyon of hatred so deep that acts of violence were often committed first, with questions asked, never. Jonathan had seen the aftermath of Apache raids, whole families slaughtered, homes burned to ash. He'd also seen what the cavalry and civilian militias did to Apache camps, and those memories haunted him just as deeply. But the boy's eyes held something that pierced through Jonathan's caution like an arrow through canvas. Pure, helpless terror, mixed with the fading ember of hope. Jonathan dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He left his rifle in its saddle scabbard and raised his hands where the boy could see them. "Easy now, son," he whispered, though he knew the child couldn't understand English. The boy flinched, pressing himself harder against the rocks, his small chest heaving with panicked breaths. Jonathan knelt in the dust, making himself smaller, less threatening. He pulled his canteen from his belt and took a long drink himself, then held it out toward the child, the universal language of water. The boy's eyes locked onto the canteen, his cracked lips parting slightly. Slowly, painfully slowly, the child reached out with a trembling hand. Jonathan set the canteen down and slid it across the dirt, then backed away. The boy grabbed it and drank desperately, water spilling down his chin and chest, some of it mixing with tears that had finally come. In that moment, watching this terrified child clutch at life through a simple canteen of water, Jonathan made his choice. He could ride away and pretend he'd seen nothing, tell himself the boy would be found by his own people, though in his heart he'd know that wasn't true. Or he could do what his conscience demanded regardless of the consequences. He chose conscience, just as he'd been taught by a father who died believing that a man's character was measured not by what he did when others were watching, but by what he did when no one would ever know. Jonathan approached again, speaking in a low, soothing tone. "Let me see that ankle, son. I'm not going to hurt you." He pointed to his own ankle, then to the boy's, miming concern. The child watched him with those enormous dark eyes, calculating risk with the ancient wisdom that Apache children learned early. Trust could mean survival or death. Carefully, Jonathan examined the injury. The ankle was badly sprained, possibly fractured. The boy wouldn't be able to walk on it, certainly not the distance he'd need to cover to reach his people. Jonathan pulled out his kerchief, soaked it with water from his canteen, and gently cleaned the gash on the boy's forehead. The child winced but didn't pull away. "Where's your family, son? Where's your camp?" Jonathan looked around, studying the landscape for clues. The child's tracks, now that he looked carefully, suggested he'd been wandering for at least a day, possibly 2. His small footprints came from the northeast toward the Mogolon Mountains, where several Apache bands maintained their camps. It would be a full day's ride, maybe more, through some of the most dangerous territory in the Southwest. Every mile would bring new dangers. What if the Apaches thought he'd kidnapped the boy? What if they killed him on sight before he could explain? What if other ranchers or cavalry patrols saw him and branded him a traitor to his own people? The hatred between settlers and Apaches ran deep, fed by decades of bloodshed on both sides. Men had been hanged for less than what he was contemplating. But as he lifted the boy gently onto his horse, feeling the small body trembling with relief and exhaustion, Jonathan couldn't imagine any other choice. "All right then," he said quietly. "Let's get you home." The boy sat in front of Jonathan's saddle, his injured leg positioned carefully to avoid pressure. Jonathan could feel the child's rapid heartbeat against his chest, the fear still present but gradually easing. They rode northeast, following the faint trail that Jonathan hoped would lead to an Apache camp. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace where the air shimmered and danced. Heat radiated from every rock, every patch of sand. Jonathan shared his water carefully. They had enough for maybe 6 hours if they rationed it, and the dried beef from his saddlebag. The boy ate ravenously, confirming Jonathan's suspicion that he'd been lost for at least 2 days without food. If you're enjoying this story, leave your like to support the channel. As they rode, Jonathan spoke softly, not expecting understanding but knowing that tone mattered more than words. "You're going to be all right, son. We'll find your people. I promise you that." The boy occasionally looked up at him, and Jonathan saw the calculation happening behind those young eyes. This white man could be trusted, at least for now. Hours passed. The landscape grew more rugged, with towering rock formations and deep arroyos that could hide an entire war party. Jonathan's hand rested near his rifle, though he knew it would be useless if warriors decided to attack. A lone man against Apache fighters would last maybe 30 seconds, rifle or not, full. His eyes scanned every ridge, every shadow, every rock formation, looking for the signs he'd learned to recognize: the glint of sunlight on metal, the sudden flight of birds, the absence of sound where sound should be. The silence was absolute, oppressive, as if the land itself was holding its breath and watching to see what would happen next. By mid-afternoon, they were deep in Apache country. Jonathan recognized landmarks from stories other ranchers had told: the twin peaks called Broken Teeth, the Red Canyon where 3 cavalry soldiers had disappeared in '76, never to be found. This was territory where white men didn't venture unless they were soldiers in force or fools with death wishes. Then he saw them. 3 Apache riders appeared on a mesa to the east, perhaps 200 yards away, perfectly still against the sky like statues carved from the land itself. Their horses didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Jonathan's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might crack bone, but he maintained his slow, steady pace. Running would mean death. Showing fear would mean death. His only chance was to project peaceful intention through every movement. He raised one hand in the universal gesture of peace, the other supporting the boy. Minutes passed like hours. The riders didn't move, didn't signal, simply observed with the infinite patience of men who had learned to read intention in the smallest gesture. who could determine friend from enemy by the way a man sat his horse. The boy suddenly called out, his voice high and urgent, waving his small arms frantically. He shouted words in Apache that Jonathan couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear: recognition, relief, joy. One of the riders spurred his horse forward, coming down the mesa in a controlled slide of dirt and stone, and Jonathan recognized the movement of a man who had found something precious that was lost. The warrior who approached was older, perhaps 50, his face carved by wind and war into something resembling the landscape itself, all sharp angles and weathered surfaces. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, the mark of a saber or knife that had nearly killed him. He wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin pants and a cotton shirt, with a red cloth band around his head. 2 feathers hung from his dark hair, and his eyes were the color of obsidian, hard and unreadable. But when he saw the boy, something fundamental shifted in his expression, something unmistakably human, unmistakably paternal. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice thick with emotion that needed no translation, and the child responded in a flood of words, gesturing toward Jonathan, toward his injured ankle, toward the canteen that had saved his life. Jonathan dismounted slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements predictable. He lowered the boy gently to the ground, supporting him so the injured ankle wouldn't bear weight. The child limped forward as fast as he could, and the warrior swept him up in his arms, holding him with a fierceness that spoke of prayers answered, of hope against hope realized. For a long moment, the Apache studied Jonathan with eyes that had witnessed more death than most men could imagine, eyes that had seen promises broken, treaties violated, children killed. The tension was unbearable, thick enough to choke on. This could end in gratitude or violence, and Jonathan had no way to know which. His fate hung on the interpretation of his actions by a man whose language he didn't speak, whose culture he barely understood. The warrior spoke, his English broken but clear, each word carefully chosen. "You bring my son home." Jonathan nodded, his mouth dry despite the water he'd drunk. Found him hurt near Copper Canyon. Seemed like the right thing to do. Many white men would not do this thing. Many would kill Apache child, leave him to die in desert, take him to soldiers. The warrior's voice carried the weight of experience, of similar situations that had ended very differently. "I'm not many white men," Jonathan replied quietly, meeting those obsidian eyes directly, the way he'd face any man speaking truth to truth. The warrior's gaze intensified, as if measuring the truth of those words against a lifetime of betrayal and broken promises, weighing Jonathan's soul on scales only he could see. The other 2 riders had descended from the mesa and sat their horses nearby, watching with the same intense scrutiny. Finally, the scarred warrior nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that transcended language and culture, that spoke of respect earned rather than assumed. He turned his horse and began riding north, the boy secured in front of him, small arms wrapped around his father's waist. The other 2 riders followed, and Jonathan thought that was the end of it. A good deed done, a life saved, nothing more expected or owed. He was profoundly wrong. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next Old West stories. As Jonathan rode back toward his ranch, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that seemed to set the desert on fire. Exhaustion weighed on him like wet canvas, not the physical tiredness of a long day's ride, but the emotional toll of walking the edge between life and death for hours, of carrying a terrified child through hostile country, of looking into the eyes of warriors who could have killed him with casual ease. He thought about the strange twist of fate that had placed that child in his path this morning, about the precarious thread of trust he'd witnessed in the warrior's eyes, about how easily the day could have ended in bloodshed and another small tragedy added to the endless list of frontier violence. He thought about Catherine and wondered what she would have said about his choice. He knew the answer. She would have been proud. She'd always said that his best quality was his inability to ignore suffering, even when ignoring it would have been easier. His ranch appeared as a dark silhouette against the burning sky, and Jonathan felt a wave of relief wash through him. Home. safety, a return to the simple solitude of his life, to the familiar routines that asked nothing of him except honest work. But as he crested the final ridge overlooking his property, he pulled sharply on the reins and Dusty stopped immediately, sensing his sudden tension. 7 riders sat motionless in front of his cabin, their horses lined in a perfect row like soldiers on parade. Even in the dimming light, Jonathan recognized the scarred warrior from earlier, along with others whose bearing and decoration suggested they were men of importance, leaders, decision-makers, men whose words carried weight in their band. His throat went dry, and his hand instinctively moved toward his rifle before he caught himself. This was either gratitude or execution, honor or vengeance, and there was no way to know until he rode down there and faced whatever judgment had been decided. Jonathan took a deep breath, steadied himself, and urged Dusty forward at a walk. Rushing would look like fear or aggression. Fleeing was impossible. They'd run him down before he made half a mile. His only option was to meet whatever came with the same dignity he'd tried to show all day. As he drew closer, details emerged from the gathering darkness. The riders had brought something. Bundles secured to their horses, items that caught the last rays of sunlight. And something that made his breath catch. 2 young horses, strong and healthy, far more valuable than anything on his modest ranch, tied to the post near his corral. The scarred warrior dismounted and walked forward with the fluid grace of a man utterly comfortable in his body, utterly confident in his purpose. In the fading light, his face was initially unreadable, but as Jonathan dismounted to meet him, he saw something unexpected, a slight softening around the eyes, the ghost of what might have been a smile. Then the warrior spoke, his words measured and deliberate, carrying the weight of ceremonial importance. "You gave my son his life when you could have taken it or ignored his suffering. This debt is sacred. My name is Nantaje. The boy you saved is Kele, my youngest son. You have honor. You are friend to my people now." Jonathan struggled to find words adequate to the moment. I just did what was right, what any decent man would do. Many know what is right. Few have courage to do it when doing it brings danger. Nantaje gestured to the gifts his men had brought. "These are from my band. 7 families give these to honor what you did. We ask permission to cross your land when we hunt the deer and antelope. We give our word. Your cattle will not be touched, your property will not be harmed. If enemies come to your ranch, we will know. If you need help, send smoke signal from the high rock to the north. We will see it and come." What Nantaje was offering was almost unheard of in this time and place. A covenant of protection and peace in a land where such things were as rare as rain in August, as precious as water in the desert. Jonathan understood the magnitude of this moment, how a single decision made in the morning had cascaded into something far larger than himself, how one act of basic humanity had bridged a chasm that decades of violence had created. The gifts represented more than material wealth. They were a statement of alliance, of trust extended across a divide that most considered unbridgeable. In accepting them, Jonathan would be binding himself to these people in ways that his own community might not understand or forgive. But just as he'd chosen conscience over safety this morning, he chose it again now. "I accept with gratitude and deep respect," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him, relief, humility, and something like awe at the unexpected grace of this moment. The warriors nodded in unison, a gesture of solemn agreement that carried ritualistic weight. Nantaje extended his hand in the white man's fashion, and Jonathan took it. The grip was firm, calloused from rope and rein and weapon, the handshake of men who understood that honor transcended race or culture, that some debts could only be paid in kind. As the Apache riders departed into the gathering darkness, becoming shadows that dissolved into the purple twilight, Jonathan stood alone in his yard, surrounded by gifts that represented more wealth than he'd seen in years. When he examined them by lantern light, he found expertly tanned buffalo and deer hides, beautifully woven blankets in patterns he'd never seen before, dried meat that would last him through the winter, and a knife of such quality that he knew it had been crafted by a master. But the real gift was something else entirely. The knowledge that in a world often defined by hatred and violence, brutality and revenge, there was still room for humanity. That a single choice to help a suffering child could transform enmity into friendship, fear into trust. Would you have made the same choice Jonathan did? Would you have risked everything to help that child? Comment below. We want to know your opinion. Over the following months, a strange and wonderful peace settled over Jonathan Wade's ranch. True to their word, Nantaje's band honored their agreement with a scrupulousness that amazed him. Jonathan would occasionally find game left near his fence line, a deer already cleaned and quartered, or wild turkeys hanging from his porch rail. Once, after a late spring storm damaged a section of his corral, he discovered that the broken rails had been mysteriously repaired with better craftsmanship than his own work. The most dramatic incident came in late September. A group of 5 drifters with hard faces and bad intentions approached Jonathan's property, the kind of men who survived by taking what others had built. Jonathan watched them from his cabin window, reaching for his rifle, calculating that he might get 2 of them before they got him. But before the drifters reached his cabin, they suddenly stopped. The leader pointed at something and an animated argument broke out among them. Then, to Jonathan's amazement, they turned their horses and rode away at speed, occasionally looking back over their shoulders like men fleeing from ghosts. Later that afternoon, Jonathan rode the perimeter of his land and found unshod hoofprints circling his entire property. At least a dozen horses, maybe more. The message was clear. This land and this man were under protection. The story of the rancher who brought home the lost Apache child spread through both communities, white and native, carried by traders, travelers, and those who lived between both worlds. Some called Jonathan a fool, others a traitor to his race. There were ranchers who refused to speak to him, who saw his friendship with Apaches as a betrayal of all the settlers who'd died in raids. But many others on both sides of that terrible divide recognized his action for what it truly was. A moment of pure humanity in a time that desperately needed it. A reminder that beyond the categories of white and Apache, settler and native, there existed something more fundamental, the simple human duty to help a suffering child. Jonathan Wade never sought recognition or reward. He simply continued his quiet life, working his land with the same dedication he'd always shown, tending his cattle through harsh winters and dry summers, and living by the code that had guided him that fateful morning, that doing what's right matters more than doing what's safe. That integrity is measured not by grand gestures but by small choices made when no one important is watching. And every sunset, as he sat on his porch and watched the desert turn gold and crimson, he remembered the weight of a frightened child against his chest, the trust in a warrior's eyes, and the profound truth that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it, to see beyond the boundaries that others insist separate us, to recognize the common humanity in eyes that look different from our own. Years later, when Jonathan Wade died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68, something extraordinary happened. His funeral was attended by ranchers and townspeople from 3 counties, but also by a group of Apache riders who sat their horses respectfully on the hill above the small cemetery. Among them was an older man with a scarred face, and beside him, a young warrior with eyes that Jonathan would have recognized. Kile, the boy whose life had been saved decades earlier, had come to honor the man who'd shown him that courage and compassion could exist even in the harshest landscape. If this story touched you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments which Old West story you want to see next. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing these narratives.